Hey everybody, Brett here. I've had a few requests over the last little while about how I get my gain tones and how I stack pedals in order to achieve said tones. And yeah, so I thought I'd do a vid really quick, kind of explain it, and I'll try and keep it fairly brief, but try and get detailed at the same time. Just going to worry about gain at this point. I'm not going to dive into everything else on the pedal board unless, you guys decide you want to hear more. If you do, let me know in the comments. Now that being said, I'm going to be playing my Mexican P bass into my pedal board. From the pedal board, I am going straight into a SansAmp RBI. I will put a picture somewhere here of said settings for RBI. And then from there, I'm going straight into the board, and there'll be nothing in post. So what you're hearing is what you're hearing. Pretty much, I'm sure at this point everybody knows what a SansAmp RBI sounds like, or a bass driver. But that's how I get my core tone. My core tone, my drive is always pretty high on the RBI. I'm usually at like 2 o'clock. We'll say somewhere between 1 and 3 o'clock, depending on the bass. That being said, here's going to be my regular reference bass tone. All right. As you can hear, I've always got a fair amount of drive. That's just the way I am. I go from my bass into the board. First thing on the board is I'm going into my Morley Pro Series 2 wah. It's also a volume pedal, and it's also got a distortion in it. The distortion is cool unto itself. I don't use it very often. My wah, when I want to wah, I also like having a big off pedal, which essentially it is, right? So I was having a volume pedal on the floor. It's also buffered, so you get your first gain stage, or your first stage in your board should always be buffered, they say, right? So there you go. From there, I go into my compressor, which I don't use very often. I basically only use it when I play with a pick just to level out my playing. From there, I go into a T-Rex Octavius. It does octave up, it does octave down, and it's got a boost as well. I don't use the boost very often, but when I do, it's there. Then first stage for gain, I use my bass Soul Food from Electro Harmonics. I then go from there into a Monty Allen's OD308. From there into a Electro Harmonics bass muff. Everybody has to have a muff on their board. If you're not going to have a muff, have a fuzz pedal of some sort. You gotta have a fuzz. And from there, so out of the muff, I go into my Flamma envelope filter. From there into a bassballs. Bassballs into the F pedals phase vibe. It does the phaser vibe. It does the univibe thing, and then it's got its own little thing, which is pretty cool too. And then I go from there into the Boss CE5 chorus ensemble. I like to have a chorus every once in a while. I don't know. Duff set precedent. You gotta have chorus every once in a while. And being a Boss pedal, it's buffered. And it's the last thing on my board before I go into a cable into the RBI. So that being said, that's my signal flow in a nutshell. Yes, you'll notice I have a bass synth pedal sitting there. It's not wired in right now. It's on and off the board. That spot kind of changes all the time as I'm knocking shit all over the place. Well done, Brett. Anyway, now let's get into it. Drive-wise, as I said, I start with my Soul Food. Now, as you'll hear, I use it very subtly. I've got the drive turned fairly high, just shy of 3 o'clock, but I also keep the blend down to about 11. So a lot of the clean signal is being passed through, but you get that nice thing that a clone does. You get that bottom end, that bump in the lower mids, 300 hertz or whatever it is. So that's my first stage. Subtle, but effective. So from the soul food, I go into the 308. With the 308, we've got, without it, with it. It adds a bump in the upper mids in a totally different spot. And it, I run, once again, I run a fair amount of drive on it. That hitting the front of the RBI, you get that effect of an old tube amp ready to explode. It rolls a little bit of the bottom end off, but that's okay. That's not necessarily a bad thing all the time. You still hold a fair amount of note definition with this pedal, and that's what I like. Now, the 308's modified Rat. I don't know what Monty's done. It doesn't sound like a Rat anymore. Amazing sounding pedal. It's got a bunch of modes, 3 of them. I run it in the boost mode. I can go through the pedal if anybody really cares, but I'm going to try and keep this fairly short. And, yeah, so I run, you can see my settings, as I said, 1 o'clock-ish on the volume. The overdrive is sitting, right around noon. And it's a big, thickening pedal. So out of the 308, I go into my fuzz. I personally really like the Electro Harmonics big muff. You got to have a big muff on your board. And I like that because of the dry switch. So everybody usually runs, their muff will sound something like, there's my regular tone. They'll run their, and it's a great tone, but you lose a lot of definition. And as you try to roll the fuzz back to get the definition back, well, you lose the cool thing the fuzz does. So I like running it in dry mode. So you're running your dry signal straight through the pedal, and now you're using the volume of the pedal to blend in the amount of the fuzz you've got. So I go from clean. Clean's still there, but now you've got all that fuzz just behind it, and I like to dial it in so it's just behind it. It almost sounds like you're running a stereo rig, right? Or a dry wet rig. Right? That's how I run it. And the reason why I run it that way is now I can start stacking my gain in front of it. So, add the soul food. Whereas before it was simple and effective, now it's menacing. As opposed to just the fuzz. Or, that's not enough for you, throw on the 308 and you get... It's different. It's completely different, and it reacts differently than the soul food does in front of the muff. That being said, that's still not enough for you. Let's throw all the stages on. Just horrendous. You instantly are taking up like 6 to 8 times the amount of sonic real estate that you were taking up without it. And that's why the Soul Food adds the Klon bump at that magic 300 hertz or whatever it is. The OD308 adds its bump wherever it is, and it's in a completely different spot, and it's somewhere in the upper mid-ish point for bass. I don't know, 1200 hertz, 1800 hertz. I don't know, somewhere in that area. So it adds a completely different spot for your growl. And since you're going in at like a 60-40 split through the muff, you can stack all these in any way you want. And that's why I can get away with a muff and a bunch of different gain in front of it. And I know a lot of people say, well, you can't run, or you should run your muff before your overdrives, or you should run, or before your distortions. Your muffs should be way at the beginning. And I totally disagree. And that is why I disagree, is because I can now start stacking things the way I do. And then from there, I will go into my filters and my modulations, and if I want to, delays and whatnot. But that's how I stack my gains. And that's why I keep my blends, when I have them, fairly low. As I said, I try to keep that 60-40 kind of split on the muff. The Monty Allums, since it doesn't have a blend knob, I roll it to that magical sweet spot where I love it. It sounds like an amp ready to pop. And yeah, I love its vibe. Now, if you don't have access to a 308, I mean, these pedals are kind of a pain in the butt to get your hands on if you don't want to build them yourself. Or they're quite pricey to buy if you don't want to build them yourself. Now, that being said, I don't run this like on my other board, on my flyout board. I just run a TS9 instead of both of these other pedals in front of it. So if you want to just grab an Ibanez TS9B, throw that into a muff, and you can cop most of what both of these do with that one pedal. Not all of the same things, but you can cop a lot of the same vibes. But my big board, I've got the space, and I really like these pedals, and I like the way they stack on top of each other to take up all that space. It's cool in the context of a band, and the reason why it's cool in the context of a band is that because they've got their little bumps in different spots, depending on who's dropping out to do a solo or what's going on, you can add them as needed. So for intros, you can stack all three of these on, or just one of them. So Soul Food and the Fuzz for an intro. And then pull it out for your verse. Right? And then you can throw it back on if need be for choruses, or just leave just the fuzz. Usually a fuzz is just enough through that. And then you get to a spot like a killer breakdown, or like let's say you're going back into like that intro-y thing for like to Inside a Pit or whatever, right? You just throw everything on and just in summation, those are my three main drives and how I stack them. Hopefully that helps anybody else who wants to get into the idea of stacking drives. It's a lot of fun, and I can grab a whole lot of variants, and then sending those variants into filters and envelopes and everything else then becomes just that much more fun. And you can just, it all comes into layers of tones and what you can do with them, right? Every one of these little boxes is like a little piece of magical inspiration. So take this as you will. Hopefully it helps. And thanks for watching.